The morning started like any other Tuesday. I was running through my mental checklist as I helped my daughter Emma get ready for school. At 12 years old, Emma had mastered most of her morning routine, but her wheelchair always needed a quick safety check before we headed out. I examined the wheels, tested the brakes, and made sure her backpack was securely fastened to the back of her chair. Everything looked perfect, just as it should. Emma had been using a wheelchair since she was 7, following complications from a rare autoimmune disorder that affected her mobility. Over the years, she'd grown from a timid little girl who saw her wheelchair as a burden into a confident young woman who decorated her wheels with colorful spoke beads and stuck motivational stickers all over the armrests. Her current wheelchair was custom-fitted prescribed by her medical team, and had taken months to get approved through insurance. It wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was her independence, her freedom, and an extension of herself. As I pulled into the drop-off lane at Riverside Middle School, I noticed Margaret Pemberton, standing near the entrance with her usual clipboard and that pinched expression she seemed to wear permanently. Margaret was the president of our neighborhood HOA and had somehow appointed herself as an unofficial school monitor. Though nobody could quite figure out by whose authority, she had a reputation for being inflexible, petty, and utterly convinced that her way was the only correct way to do anything. Emma rolled herself out of the van using the automatic ramp I'd had installed. She was chatting excitedly about a science project presentation she had later that day. I called out my usual goodbye, told her I loved her, and reminded her that I'd pick her up at 3. She waved without looking back, already heading toward the entrance where her best friend Sophia was waiting. I should have stayed. Looking back now, I should have waited until she was completely inside the building. But I was running late for a work meeting, and I trusted that the school was a safe place. I trusted wrong. According to what I pieced together later from multiple witnesses, Margaret approached Emma before she even reached the door. Several students reported hearing Margaret's sharp voice cutting through the normal morning chatter. She was apparently upset about Emma's wheelchair being parked in the designated drop-off zone the previous afternoon while I ran inside to deliver Emma's forgotten lunch. Emma, polite as always, apparently tried to explain that she hadn't been the one controlling where the wheelchair was at that moment, as she'd been inside the school. This reasonable response seemed to enrage Margaret further. Witnesses said her face turned red, and she started ranting about entitled parents and special treatment and how rules apply to everyone. What happened next still makes my blood run cold. Multiple students, 2 teachers, and even the school security camera captured Margaret grabbing Emma's wheelchair and, in an apparent fit of rage, deliberately tipping it backward. Emma, caught completely off guard, tumbled out onto the concrete. But Margaret wasn't done. In what can only be described as a moment of pure, unhinged fury, she began kicking at the wheelchair's mechanisms. The custom joystick controller that Emma used to navigate independently was ripped from its mounting. Margaret stomped on it repeatedly, crushing the expensive electronic components under her heel. She grabbed one of the wheels and wrenched it violently, bending the axle. The cushioned seat that had been specifically designed for Emma's medical needs was torn partially free from its base. In less than 2 minutes, Marguerite had caused thousands of dollars in damage to medical equipment that a child depended on for basic mobility. The entire campus seemed to freeze in that moment. Students stood with their mouths open in shock. Teachers came running from different directions. The normal buzz of morning arrival went completely silent except for the sound of Margaret's heavy breathing and Emma's quiet crying as she lay on the cold concrete, unable to get up without assistance. Vice Principal Rodriguez reached them first. He helped Emma into a sitting position while simultaneously shouting for the school nurse. Other staff members formed a protective circle around Emma while staring at Margaret with expressions of absolute disbelief. This was unprecedented. Everyone had known Margaret was difficult, but this level of aggression toward a disabled child was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Margaret seemed to suddenly realize what she'd done. The rage drained from her face, replaced by something that might have been panic, or perhaps just fear of consequences. She started stammering something about being disrespected and how she was just trying to teach a lesson, about following rules. Her words sounded hollow and absurd in the face of what she'd just done. Someone had already called the school resource officer, who arrived within minutes. Someone else had called me. I received the call just as I was parking at my office, 12 minutes away from the school. The secretary's voice was shaking as she told me there had been an incident involving Emma and that I needed to come back immediately. She assured me Emma wasn't seriously injured, but that her wheelchair had been damaged and I needed to return right away. Those 12 minutes back to the school were the longest of my life. My mind raced through possibilities, each scenario worse than the last. Had Emma been hit by a car? Had the wheelchair malfunctioned? Had another student hurt her? Never in my wildest imagination did I consider what had actually happened. When I pulled into the school parking lot, there were already 2 police cars parked near the entrance. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears as I ran toward the building. A staff member I vaguely recognized intercepted me at the door and guided me quickly toward the nurse's office. speaking in soothing tones that I could barely process through my panic. Emma was sitting on the nurse's examination table, tears streaming down her face, with the school nurse checking her over for injuries. Her wheelchair, or what remained of it, sat a few feet away looking like it had been through a demolition derby. The joystick controller hung by wires, the screen completely shattered. One wheel was bent at an unnatural angle. The seat cushion was half detached and torn. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I rushed to Emma and wrapped her in my arms, checking her over with my own hands, even though the nurse assured me she had only minor scrapes on her palms from catching herself when she fell. Emma was sobbing into my shoulder, and through her tears, she kept saying, "She broke my chair, Mom. She just broke it. Why would she do that?" I had no answer for her. What could I possibly say that would make sense of an adult deliberately destroying a child's medical equipment? Vice Principal Rodriguez stood nearby with a grim expression, and he quietly filled me in on what had happened. With each detail, my shock transformed into a cold, focused anger unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The school resource officer, Officer Chun, came in and asked if he could speak with me privately. In the hallway, he explained that Margaret had been detained and that they were in the process of deciding what charges would be filed. He needed my statement and asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely yes. I wanted to press charges. What Margaret had done wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was assault on a minor and destruction of medical property. Officer Chun nodded solemnly and told me that multiple witnesses had provided statements, and the entire incident had been captured on the school's security cameras. The evidence was overwhelming. He also mentioned that Margaret had been belligerent when initially confronted, claiming she had a right to enforce community standards, even on school property, which was apparently a delusion she'd been operating under for some time. Meanwhile, the school's administrative response was swift. Principal Hernandez arrived within the hour, having been called back from a district meeting. She met with me personally, expressing her horror at what had occurred, and assuring me that Margaret would be permanently banned from school property. She also mentioned that the school would be reviewing how they'd allowed Margaret to have such regular access to campus in the first place, as she'd never actually been an approved volunteer. The school resource officer, Officer Chun, came in and asked if he could speak with me privately. In the hallway, he explained that Margaret had been detained and that they were in the process of deciding what charges would be filed. He needed my statement and asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely yes. I wanted to press charges. What Margaret had done wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was assault on a minor and destruction of medical property. Officer Chun nodded solemnly and told me that multiple witnesses had provided statements, and the entire incident had been captured on the school's security cameras. The evidence was overwhelming. He also mentioned that Margaret had been belligerent when initially confronted, claiming she had a right to enforce community standards, even on school property, which was apparently a delusion she'd been operating under for some time. Meanwhile, the school's administrative response was swift. Principal Hernandez arrived within the hour, having been called back from a district meeting. She met with me personally, expressing her horror at what had occurred, and assuring me that Margaret would be permanently banned from school property. She also mentioned that the school would be reviewing how they'd allowed Margaret to have such regular access to campus in the first place, as she'd never actually been an approved volunteer. But the immediate practical problem remained. Emma's wheelchair was completely unusable, and she needed to get home. The school offered to let me borrow a basic transport wheelchair they kept for emergencies, but it wasn't remotely suitable for Emma's needs. It had no proper support, no controls she could operate herself, and would essentially render her completely dependent on being pushed everywhere. I called Emma's wheelchair specialist in a panic. The woman I spoke with was sympathetic, but delivered devastating news. Emma's wheelchair was custom-made to her specifications with specialized components. Even if insurance approved a replacement immediately, which could take weeks or even months, the actual manufacturing and fitting process would take additional time. In the meantime, we'd need to arrange a temporary rental, which insurance might not fully cover. And even rental options with appropriate features were limited. The financial reality hit me like a freight train. Emma's current wheelchair had cost nearly $40,000, most of which had been covered by insurance after extensive documentation and appeals. The deductible alone had been significant. Now we were looking at potential rental costs, medical assessments to document Emma's current needs, endless phone calls with insurance companies, and the possibility that we might need to pay out of pocket for a temporary solution while fighting to get a permanent replacement covered. I stepped back into the nurse's office and saw Emma sitting quietly. Her earlier tears dried, but her expression devastated. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without her familiar wheelchair beside her. Sophia, her best friend, had been allowed to stay with her and was holding her hand. Seeing Emma's crushed spirit hurt worse than any of the financial implications. We spent the next several hours at the school dealing with police reports, insurance documentation, and witness statements. The school counselor came to check on Emma and offered to set up ongoing sessions if Emma wanted to talk about what had happened. Multiple teachers stopped by to express their outrage and support. Emma's science teacher promised she could present her project another day, which at least relieved one of Emma's immediate worries. By early afternoon, I'd arranged for my sister to bring over an old manual wheelchair we'd kept in storage from years ago when Emma first lost mobility. It was completely inadequate for Emma's current needs, lacking the proper support and positioning features her body required, but it would at least get her home. Watching Emma struggle to adjust to equipment that didn't fit her properly made my anger at Margaret burned even hotter. The school district's legal team contacted me that same afternoon. They wanted to assure me that the district took this incident extremely seriously and would be cooperating fully with law enforcement. They also mentioned, somewhat delicately, that they anticipated I might be pursuing civil action against Margaret personally, and while they couldn't provide legal advice, they wanted me to know they would make all relevant documentation and footage available as needed. News of the incident spread through our community like wildfire. By the time we got home that afternoon, I had dozens of messages from other parents expressing shock and offering support. Several people offered to testify about their own negative experiences with Margaret's overreach and aggressive behavior. It seemed that Margaret had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, but most people had simply endured her petty tyranny over parking spaces, lawn ornaments, and paint colors. Attacking a child's medical equipment was apparently the final straw that broke through everyone's tolerance. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, appointments, and bureaucratic nightmares. I took emergency leave from work to manage the chaos. Emma stayed home from school, partly because we were waiting for a better temporary wheelchair solution, and partly because she was emotionally shaken and not ready to return to where the incident had happened. The police moved quickly with charges. Margaret was formally charged with assault on a minor, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. The prosecution was treating it seriously, partly because the evidence was so overwhelming, and partly because of the particularly cruel nature of attacking a child's mobility device. The assistant district attorney I spoke with mentioned that crimes targeting people with disabilities often carried enhanced penalties, and they intended to pursue this aggressively. Margaret's response was to hire an expensive lawyer who immediately began trying to spin a narrative about misunderstanding, an accident. In a statement that made my blood boil, her attorney claimed that Margaret had simply been trying to move the wheelchair out of what she perceived as a dangerous location and had accidentally damaged it in the process. This version of events was so contradictory to the video evidence and witness testimony that it was almost laughable. Except there was nothing funny about any of this. My own attorney, whom I'd retained for the civil case, was a sharp woman named Diana Torres who specialized in disability rights law. She reviewed all the evidence and told me we had an exceptionally strong case, not just against Margaret personally, but potentially against the HOA as well, since Margaret had been acting in her capacity as HOA president and had used her HOA authority to justify her presence at the school. The community response was overwhelming and moved me to tears more than once. A local parents group organized a fundraiser to help cover our out-of-pocket expenses while we fought with insurance. Within 3 days, they'd raised over $15,000. Local news stations picked up the story, and the coverage was universally sympathetic to Emma. Margaret's name and face were plastered across social media with people expressing outrage at her actions. The HOA itself went into damage control mode. At an emergency meeting, which I attended virtually, the board voted unanimously to remove Margaret from her position as president, effective immediately. Several board members, clearly worried about liability, gave speeches condemning her actions and insisting they had never authorized her to enforce HOA rules off HOA property. 3 board members resigned entirely, apparently wanting no association with the incident. Margaret's neighbors began sharing their own stories publicly. One couple described how she'd filed a complaint with the city claiming their wheelchair ramp violated aesthetic guidelines, trying to force them to remove accessible features from their own home. Another family shared emails where Margaret had harassed them about their son's medical equipment being visible in their yard. A pattern emerged of Margaret specifically targeting people with disabilities under the guise of maintaining community standards. Emma's wheelchair specialist worked with us to expedite a rental of appropriate equipment while we navigated the replacement process. The temporary chair wasn't perfect, but it at least had proper support and control as Emma could manage herself. Watching her regain some independence, even with unfamiliar equipment, was a small relief in an otherwise devastating situation. The insurance battle was its own nightmare. Our insurance company initially tried to claim that destruction of property should be covered by homeowners insurance or by Marguerite's liability insurance, not by medical insurance. We had to get Emma's doctors to write detailed letters explaining that this wasn't just property damage but damage to prescribed medical equipment, essential for her health and daily functioning. Every phone call seemed to involve being transferred 5 times and repeating our story to people who seemed skeptical that anyone would actually destroy a child's wheelchair. Emma started having nightmares. She'd wake up crying, sometimes reliving the moment of falling, sometimes dreaming that other people were destroying her things. We increased her counseling sessions too, twice weekly. Her therapist explained that Emma was experiencing symptoms of trauma and anxiety, which was completely normal after such a violation. Hearing a mental health professional confirm that my daughter was traumatized by what Marjorie had done added another layer to my fury. The school was incredibly supportive. Principal Hernandez called personally to check on Emma and assured her that she was welcome back whenever she felt ready. Emma's teacher sent work home and offered to set up video calls so she could participate in classes remotely if she wanted. Her classmates made her a huge banner with supportive messages and drawings. Sophia came over almost every day after school, which seemed to help Emma more than anything else. Media attention intensified when a disability rights advocacy group picked up our story. They issued a statement condemning the attack and calling for strong legal consequences. They also highlighted how Margaret's actions reflected broader societal attitudes that treated accessibility equipment as inconvenient rather than necessary. A representative from the group reached out to offer support and connect us with additional resources. Margaret's lawyer made a settlement offer 2 weeks after the incident. It was insultingly low, barely enough to cover our insurance deductible, let alone the emotional trauma, time lost from work, or ongoing expenses. Diana immediately rejected it and countered with a demand that included full replacement costs of the wheelchair, all medical and therapeutic expenses related to Emma's trauma, compensation for pain and suffering, and punitive damages to send a clear message that this behavior was unacceptable. The HOA's insurance company also reached out, trying to negotiate separately. They were clearly worried about their exposure and wanted to settle quickly to avoid a trial. Diana advised patience, knowing that as the criminal case progressed and more details became public, the pressure on all parties to settle favorably would increase. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months out, but Margaret's lawyer clearly advised her that fighting the charges was futile given the evidence. 3 months after the incident, she accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to assault and destruction of property. The sentence included 6 months in jail with the possibility of serving half on house arrest, 3 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, a permanent restraining order keeping her away from Emma and our family, and court restitution. The restitution hearing was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. The judge reviewed all the documentation, the $40,000 wheelchair replacement cost, the rental expenses for temporary equipment, my lost wages, Emma's therapy bills, and various other expenses directly resulting from Margaret's actions. The judge ordered Margaret to pay full restitution of nearly $68,000. Her face went pale when the amount was announced. Her lawyer tried to argue for a payment plan, which the judge granted, but the monthly payments were substantial enough that Margaret, would be financially impacted for years. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal conviction. Between Margaret's personal liability and the HOA's insurance, we received a settlement that covered not just our concrete expenses but also compensation for Emma's emotional trauma and punitive damages. I can't disclose the exact amount due to the settlement agreement, but it was substantial enough to secure Emma's future needs and establish a trust for her ongoing care. Beyond the financial resolution, there were other changes that emerged from this horrible incident. The school district implemented new policies about who could have access to campus and under what circumstances. They also created a specific protocol for protecting students' medical equipment and assistive devices, with clear consequences for anyone who interfered with them. Principal Hernandez told me that Emma's case had prompted important conversations about disability awareness throughout the district. Our HOA underwent a complete transformation. New leadership was elected, and one of their first actions was to revise the governing documents to explicitly prohibit discrimination based on disability and to ensure that accessibility features were always permitted regardless of aesthetic guidelines. They invited a disability rights attorney to educate the board on legal obligations and best practices. Several neighbors told me they felt the community had been awakened to issues they'd never previously considered. Emma's recovery was slower and more complex than I'd hoped, but she was resilient. It took nearly 4 months before she felt comfortable returning to school full-time, but when she did, the school had organized an awareness assembly about disability rights where Emma was welcomed back as a hero for speaking up about what happened. She found strength in her story, realizing that her experience had created positive change. Her new wheelchair arrived 7 months after the original was destroyed. The insurance battle had been exhausting, but we eventually got approval for a model that was even better suited to her current needs. Emma personalized it immediately, choosing purple spoke beads and stickers that said things like "Unstuck" and "Warrior Princess." She told me that she wanted everyone to see that what happened hadn't broken her spirit, The legal consequences followed Margaret for years. Beyond the criminal conviction and restitution, she faced social ostracism in the community. Several of her friends distanced themselves from her. She eventually moved away, selling her house at a loss. I felt no sympathy. Actions have consequences, and she'd earned every bit of what she faced. The experience changed me too. I became active in disability advocacy, joining the local chapter of the group that had supported us. I spoke at schools and community events about the importance of protecting people with disabilities from discrimination and harassment. I shared Emma's story, with her permission, to help others understand that accessibility isn't a courtesy or special treatment, but a fundamental right. Emma grew from the experience in ways I never expected. She became more confident, more willing to advocate for herself and others. She started a disability awareness club at her school. She made a presentation to the city council about accessibility in public spaces. She transformed her trauma into purpose, channeling her experience into creating positive change. Looking back now, years later, I still feel anger when I think about that morning. The image of my daughter's destroyed wheelchair and her crushed expression will never completely fade, but is balanced now by pride in how Emma emerged stronger, by gratitude for a community that rallied around us, and by satisfaction that justice was served. Margaret's moment of rage cost her everything: her reputation, her freedom, her financial security, and her place in the community. Meanwhile, Emma thrived. She graduated middle school with honors, continued her advocacy work, and never let anyone make her feel less than whole. In the end, the person who tried to destroy a disabled child's independence ended up destroying only herself, while that child proved to be truly indestructible. The wheelchair that was destroyed was just equipment, replaceable despite the hassle. But what Margaret couldn't destroy, no matter how hard she tried, was Emma's spirit, her dignity, or her right to exist fully in the world. That lesson, bitter as it was to learn, became the foundation for everything that came after. And in some strange way, Margaret's worst moment became the catalyst for our family's greatest growth and our community's awakening to the importance of protecting its most vulnerable members.